and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted to be with you for this episode. I have a great interview for you today. I'll be speaking with author Jay Lee about his new thriller, The Deadly Deal. Before we start, I would like to ask that you like and follow this show. That is really helpful to get the show out to more listeners. So as I said, I am interviewing author Jay Lee today. This is my very first video podcast. I've been doing the GSMC Book Review podcast since 2016. I have done over 300, if you started listening to audio podcasts and interviews, you could listen to one a day and listen for over a year. I've done over 365 videos. So the audio podcast concept is a little bit new to me. I'm not used to it. It's still a work in progress. You will see my background here. It could use some work. You've got the reflection going on with, you can see my screen here and what I am working on. If I move my head, maybe, then that blocks a little bit of it. But I'm excited for this new adventure. It is, as I said, an adventure, and it is a work in progress. So bear with me as I work on figuring out backgrounds and lighting and everything else. This is a street in Portugal. I live currently in Portugal, and I am, you're seeing a random street in Portugal behind me. So that's kind of cool. As I said, I've been doing the podcast for since 2016. So if you are joining me from the audio podcast, you already know me and the interviews that I do. If this is new, welcome. I'm very, very excited to have you join the GSMC Book Review family of listeners. But as I mentioned, I am interviewing author Jay Lee today. We are talking about his new thriller, The Deadly Deal. It is a thriller based in big pharma. Okay, so let me go ahead and give you the description of this book. Again, it is called The Deadly Deal. The author is Jay Lee. Here is that description. David Centrelli is a junior business development executive at a pharmaceutical company in Richmond with no military training or criminal record whatsoever. But an innocent knock on the door one typical Monday morning changes his life forever. Thrust into a world of unbelievable accusations, outrageous claims, and dangers he's only seen in the movies, he's told that his best friend's death 2 weeks earlier was no accident, and that his buddy has a message for him from the grave. As skeptical as he is, clues far too specific to be coincidental keep coming, and soon his own home is engulfed in flames. When the perpetrator contacts him, he learns that not only are the accusations legitimate, but that people trained to eliminate problems have labeled him one. Blackmailed by decisions he made years ago, informed that his brother has been kidnapped and threatened with a future not even his worst nightmare could imagine, the temptation to give up what he knows and disappear into affluent anonymity grows stronger by the second, until he learns that millions of lives depend on him trying to do the right thing. But can this ordinary businessman really escape death from experts trained to administer it and prevent a colossal calamity already set in motion by the highest levels of government? It is it's character driven. Of course, the plot is character driven. There is a compelling main character in David. There is another character that we're going to talk about in the interview that I really liked. Her name is Anne, but it's not terribly graphic. It's not like really, really scary, but it is very intense and it will suck you in. So as I have given you a bit of an overview of the story and the book itself, let's go ahead and let Jay talk more about this book, the writing of the book, the inspiration behind it, etc. Hi, Jay. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for being here. It is early for you, so thanks for getting up and getting your day started by talking to me. We are going to talk about your new thriller, The Deadly Deal. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes just to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be great.
Oh, absolutely. And let me just say that it's a delightful way to start the day to get the chance to talk to you. So my name is Jay Lee, and I've been I've been writing books for, publishing them for the past 6 years or so. I've had three published books, and I've got a fourth one coming out in October. But more on the personal side, I live in the western suburbs of Chicago with my wife and two small children. We've been in this area for about 10 years, and this kind of goes back to my childhood roots, but we've spent time living in the North Carolina area as well after our university experience. And my day job is more in program management and sales and operations for a subsidiary of Caterpillar. So writing has always been a passion. It's something that I love to do, and I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to get some books out there and connect with some readers, and it's just been a wild ride. So really appreciate you having me, and really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And I don't know if you can hear now, there is a traffic jam here in my little town. So when that happens, people immediately start honking. I'm not sure if you can hear the cars honking. Doesn't do them any good, but it makes them feel better, apparently.
Can't even hear it from where I sit, so we're good to go.
That's good. The traffic's bad if you can hear it all the way from Portugal to Chicago.
Indeed.
So your new thriller is The Deadly Deal. It centers on Big Pharma. Can you give an overview of the story?
Sure, yeah. So The Deadly Deal was published in September of 2023, and it centers around a protagonist who works at a pharmaceutical company in the business development division. And essentially what happens is he finds out that there's been a little bit of a conspiracy between the company that he works for, the federal government, and a private insurance company that's backing the drug that's in development in his company. And he has to make some very critical decisions around what he's going to try to do to prevent a really bad thing from happening, potentially at his own expense. And it's just meant to be an entertaining read that someone can sit down and enjoy, but it has undertones of real world applications to it. I actually used to work in a division that did pharmaceutical process research. So the baseline for the potential of this type of idea to take place is very much rooted in fact. Now, things have changed since the initial draft was written. The fun part about this book for me on a personal level is the first draft was inked about 17 years ago. Okay. So I wrote this book, and it's kind of been a full circle story for me, if you don't mind me sharing what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wrote this book. I really liked this book, went out, got a literary agent, and the literary agent was about 2 weeks away from submitting it to some of the traditional big five publishers at the time. Mm-hmm. And got some very, very disturbing news that he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Oh, no.
And, I didn't know him particularly well, but we had formed enough of a relationship over time that I said, Jay, I don't think that you should keep doing this. You should be with family, and that was, from a selfish perspective, I know it sounds terrible to say that, but it was a hard thing to do because I was this close to pursuing my dream, right? And all that good stuff. But, there are bigger things in life than writing and dreams and all that good stuff. And Jay really needed to go be with his family. He did subsequently pass away. And I kind of tucked this thing in the drawer, and life went on, met my wife, got married, all sorts of stuff happens. But I kept writing along the way, and I had published two other books. My first book was called The Hubley Case. It was published in 2018. My second book is called The Silent Cardinal. It was published a few years later. But I always had this story, sitting in that drawer, and I always really, really liked it. And it certainly evoked some emotion thinking about my former agent and everything. But I ultimately decided to give it a look, dust it off, had to make some substantial changes to the details because various types of cars were no longer in existence.
Yeah, 17 years in terms of technology is huge.
That's right. That's right. You know, the proliferation of social media and even how people use cell phones. A lot changes in almost 2 decades, but the core of the story, the sort of original big picture idea that you could have these three powerful entities conspire together to launch a conspiracy was still very applicable. And so I decided to work on that story. It felt like, in a lot of ways, it felt like just as much work as starting fresh, because I did go through a very comprehensive edit. But it was extremely rewarding the day it got published, because it felt like, gosh, this is a big chunk of my life has occurred between its initial draft and its publication, and here we are. So this one will always have kind of a special place in my heart. Of all the books that I know I'll write, this one has sort of a special place in my heart because of that history.
Absolutely. And, you know, in a small way, it probably feels a little bit like a tribute to the man who was helping you in the beginning, which is it's a nice testament to him.
Thank you. I hope so.
Hi, Jay. Now that you've been introduced to Jay and the Deadly Deal, we are going to take our first break of this episode. I do find it interesting, as I am talking to authors, listening to how sometimes they start a book and then it doesn't get published for various reasons, or it sits in a drawer. I do find the timing interesting, but you know, sometimes I think they get written when they are ready to be written, or when the timing is right. But I do find that interesting. As I said, we're going to take our first break of this episode. When we come back, Jay will be talking about the inspiration, behind the Deadly Deal. What was that jumping off point for the story itself? So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As you know, I'm speaking today with author Jay Lee about The Deadly Deal. Before the break, he was talking about the fact that this is his third published novel, but it was actually the first novel that he wrote. It just did not get published in the same time frame. The other two were published before this. We're going to go back now to the interview with Jay. Again, the book is The Deadly Deal. You mentioned the baseline and working in a pharmaceutical setting. Was that your initial inspiration, or what was that first jumping off point for the story?
Yeah, so I had been assigned as a marketing analyst to understand the pharmaceutical drug approval process within the FDA. And so I basically became a little research guru, asked lots of questions, did a lot of reading. And it's very intricate, because, as you can imagine, and ironically enough, with the pandemic and everything that has occurred in the past couple of years, we've actually seen this play out in real life. There are different paths that drugs go down to getting formally approved. If you're talking about a remedy for a very dangerous disease that has no other solution, the FDA has one kind of path. And if you're talking about something that already has a solution out there, there's another. And so it sort of started with me understanding how that process worked, and maybe just a little bit of an overactive imagination, wondering, okay, well, if somebody had really bad intentions and they were very connected in these areas, you could actually push a drug through that's not ready. And that's, not to give too much away to the readers, but that's the premise of the story.
Right.
And it all kind of spiraled from there. It just sort of started with this idea that I had, that well, gosh, now that I kind of understand what these drug companies go through to get something on the shelf that we all take every day, you put kind of a little imaginative twist on it, and you have to think the worst of people in some cases, right? As with all thrillers, the villains are not humanitarians. But when I added all of that up, I thought, this is kind of an intriguing story, and it's based on some factual understanding of the process. I'll put pen to paper on it, and here we are.
And I'm nodding my head while you're saying you're talking about those paths, as though I know what you're talking about, but I only know what you're talking about because it's in the book. So that's a key factor to why a lot of the events that take place in the book take place. It's always tricky with thrillers because you don't want to give really much of anything away. So we have to talk around things, but I think that's your next assignment. Write a thriller where the villain is a humanitarian.
Well, it's funny.
It's
funny that you say that, Sarah, because in all honesty, the book that I will be publishing in October, he thinks that he is.
Okay.
The villain believes, is kind of think of Immanuel Kant and ethical views. He views himself as a utilitarian. So he's doing some really, really bad things, but he's justified it in his head because he thinks that in the long run, it's what's best for the country, which is certainly not the case in The Deadly Deal. In The Deadly Deal, they're just bad dudes that want to make a lot of money.
A lot of money, yes.
But it's interesting how sometimes, the villains in our stories, it really can be about a matter of perspective as opposed to straight black and white.
Right.
So fun little segue there.
But I think that makes your villain more multifaceted. But you don't want black and white. You need layers of gray in characters to make them more human. Sure. So speaking of humans and characters, David is our protagonist in The Deadly Deal. Can you talk a little bit about him as that main character? What about him is going to resonate with readers?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So David is probably my favorite protagonist of all the ones that I've written. And the reason why is because he's the most relatable to myself and the vast majority of the people who will be reading the book. My first two books, the protagonist was a former Navy SEAL who had special ops training and had been specifically trained on how to deal with some sticky situations. So it wasn't all that outlandish that he would somehow navigate his way through those dangerous situations. But David is a business guy. He's mid-30s. He has a job at a pharmaceutical company. He's a little bit of a rising star. He's had some people break his trust in the past that's kind of hardened his shell a little bit. He's not a very trusting person. You might even look at him at the onset of the story as being selfish and sort of self-focused. But in a lot of ways, he's very relatable to what I would call the everyday Joe. Just goes to work every day, lives in Richmond, Virginia, likes to drive a cool car, and that's just sort of what he does. And all of a sudden, he's thrust into this situation where people are trying to kill him. He doesn't know why. He lost his best friend. He doesn't know why. And he's been sent these clues from his best friend before his best friend passed away, basically instructing him to figure out what's going on here, because there's something bigger at stake than either one of them. So one of the most rewarding parts about this book for me, and this really came out more in the re-editing, this wasn't as present in the initial draft that I wrote 17 years ago, but in the final edits, one of the things that really came through for me was David's transformation and his willingness to start trusting other people, and his acceptance that, look, I went through some rough things, but that doesn't mean that my life in the future has to be that way. And he makes some self-sacrifices for the greater good, which is not necessarily something that he would do at the very start of the story. So the character himself is a real evolution and meant to be very relatable. He doesn't learn how to, scale a wall in 10 seconds and run away from the bad guys. He's just kind of an everyday Joe caught up in a very not everyday situation. And that's what most of the readers that have been, kind enough to reach out, like that's one of the things that they've said is that they love how relatable he is, and how he reacts to situations. And that was also one of the hardest parts about the writing was, if you've got, two trained killers trying to get him, how is it that this everyday guy is gonna make it, right? Like, what's gonna happen here? So coming up with the specifics of those scenes and making it both tension filled and realistic was a challenge. It was a challenge, but it was a whole lot of fun. And David is probably my favorite protagonist that I've ever written.
Nice.
Long-winded answer. Sorry for ranting.
You're good. You're good. But he's not alone. So he's not figuring everything out on his own. He does have someone who is helping him, a heretofore stranger, before they are thrown into this situation by the best friend. Can you talk a little bit about Anne as well? She's not the main character, but I don't think David would have gotten as far with in this situation without her kind of pushing him.
Oh, absolutely. In a lot of ways, Anne is a co-protagonist. I mean, Anne was a really, really amazing character to write. So she was the secretary of his best friend, and very, very competent, smarter than David in a lot of ways, very, very confident in who she is and what she stands for, whereas in David is a little more timid in those categories. But essentially what happens is, prior to his best friend's accidental death, his best friend reaches out to Anne as a confidant and says, if anything happens to me, you need to get this package to this guy. And you can imagine the terror that she felt when she was even told that, right? Like, what are you talking about? What's going to happen to you? Like, stop freaking me out here, right? But then when it actually happens, that he dies in an apartment fire, and Anne puts two and two together and says, I don't think that this was an accident. The strength that she displays in the story is incredible. And it was really, really fun to write because, she basically has to whip David into shape. David doesn't really want anything to do with it. He's kind of self-focused. He's a little egotistical at the start. He just wants to be left alone. He's upset that he lost his friend in a fire, but he doesn't want to get involved with any of this, right? And Anne is really the driving force. You said that he would not have gone as far without her. Absolutely not. The whole book really does center around her getting David to realize the right thing to do here. And in that respect, I view her as just as much of a protagonist as David, and in a lot of ways, a lot more noble. She also has her own history. She has her own, we all do, right?
Sure, yeah.
We're all humans. But the one thing about Anne that was just really, really fun, and I would love to meet her, she would be, I would rather meet her than David. But Anne just so confidently knows what the right thing to do is, even at her own expense, and demonstrates that from the get-go. And David learns from her along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of character development, when you sit down to write a new story, maybe you have the idea of the story, of the idea of the characters. How much character development do you like to do before the writing? And how much do you like to let just develop naturally as you write?
That's a great question, Sarah. I would say that character development is probably the one area that I've really tried to put a lot of emphasis on in the last couple of years of my writing. I would identify it as a weakness relative to plotting. Though, like the way my brain works, and everybody's different, I always start with the idea, and I kind of map out from A to Z what I think, would be kind of a fun idea and litmus test it and start first with plot. But books are about people, and people that are reading books need to connect with those people. And I would say that it's something that when I read my first couple books, it's not that there's bad character development. It's that it's not as strong as the last couple books. It's an area that I've tried to put more emphasis into. So when I write now, once I have that outline and thought around the story itself, I actually take conscious efforts to think through each of the characters and put notes to their backstory, to their description, to their mannerisms that I never did before. I used to just sort of let it all flow and evolve. And the problem with me, and I'm sure some people can do it, some people, they can just start writing a book and they just write this fantastic book and they have no plotting, no outline. I'm very jealous of that, right?
Yeah.
But what happens with me if I don't take that time with the character development is I revert back to more cliche type things with their personality traits, things that they do, mannerisms, etc. So to your point, I actually make a concerted effort to sit down and say, okay, what's special about this person? Why does the reader connect with this person? How can I make this person more realistic, et cetera, et cetera? But that's new. I haven't done that throughout my entire writing career.
Okay. That's interesting, because that shows, kind of your evolution as a writer. What works for you, what have you tried to work on, etc. That's nice. No matter how many authors I speak to, I still love hearing about their character development, how they come up with characters, how those characters develop. It is just slightly different for every author, and I love hearing about the process. We are going to take our next break for this episode. When we come back, we will be talking about research, the different types of research that went into writing The Deadly Deal. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
You mentioned the baseline.
Welcome
and
back.
Working in a pharmaceutical setting. Was that your initial inspiration, or what was? My apologies. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. It is a work in progress, isn't it? Before the break, we were talking about character development and how those characters evolve through the writing. We are now, of course, as I said before the break, going to talk about some of the research that went into the writing of The Deadly Deal. So let's return now to the interview with Jay Lee. And then research, I can imagine you had to do a ton of different types of research for this book.
Hi, Jay. Welcome to the podcast.
If you want to talk about some of that was particularly interesting to you, that's great. I also want to know how you take all of that research and boil it down into what you need to not overwhelm the reader.
Yeah, no, another great question, Sarah. I do a lot of research because it's important to me. If somebody is spending some of their hard-earned money and taking their time to read a book that I've written, I want that product to be as good as I can make it. And a part of that is being factual and being descriptive and telling the readers something that they might not otherwise know. So really that falls into a couple of different categories. And I've actually written a guest article on this very subject for, I think, Killer Nashville. But I divide the research into two distinct categories. There's big picture, and then there's nitty gritty, right? Mm-hmm. And the big picture is much more fundamental to the plot. And a great example would be, the research of how a drug is approved and everything. And a lot of times the big picture research stems from what we know, right? So if we live in a world of doing pharmaceutical research, we have some knowledge about it beforehand. We decide to put a pen to paper on it. If we're a former member of the military, we might know a lot about how military processes work, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times that big picture research starts with the author drawing on his or her own experience and then just providing some insight that the rest of us don't know, right? And I try very hard to do that in my writing, because I do think it's fascinating how drugs get approved. You walk into any pharmacy, you see all these drugs on the shelf, and it's like, well, I don't know how they got there. Should I really take this? My 6-year-old is feeling a little sick. Should I just pick this thing up and give this medicine? What's this medicine been through to make sure that this is a good thing for me to do,
Yeah, exactly.
right? So that's kind of how I view big picture, and that just really involves lots of reading, lots of understanding, and drawing on personal experience. And I would say that in big picture, in my personal experience, for about, and I don't know why I know this, but I actually looked at it one day and like counted everything up. For every paragraph of information that's in the Deadly Deal, there were about of how the process works. There were 17 pages of notes.
Whew.
And so I don't know what prompted me to look that up, but there's a couple of really technical paragraphs in there that describe this process and that process and how drugs work and all that other stuff. And just for your own knowledge, okay, every paragraph that you read was pulled from 17 pages of notes that I had taken on the subject. So that's big picture. But the other one is nitty gritty, which is describing a setting, describing, what a room looks like, smells like, what sounds there are. And that I try very hard to go to the places that I write in and actually take them in for myself, right? And so I try to choose settings that I have been to or that I can easily access. And I've actually done crazy things. Like I'll give you a funny story, Sarah. For one of my books, the opening scene starts with a bomb threat at a train station in downtown Chicago called Ogilvy Transportation Center. So I actually went to Ogilvy and I had a camera and I was taking in the scenes, like, okay, what stores are there and what does it smell like? How loud is it? And I actually had security approach me because they had identified me as being a suspicious character.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah, not wrongly so. I wasn't thinking about it. I'm like, oh, I'm just writing a book here. But I think that the readers really appreciate it, because if you can describe in detail, that this is a one-way street on a one-way street, or that this alley has this, has that, it makes the reader feel more a part of it, because we live life seeing that detail, right? Like nobody just walks on a road. They walk on a two-way street with you just said today, right? You said people are honking their horns because of a traffic jam, right?
Yep.
So we live as humans, we live in a detailed world, and our brain takes in all these senses, and we're processing them on an unconscious level even. So when we read a book, if there's some way that we can identify with that level of detail to help us paint the picture, imagine that we're there, I think it enhances the enjoyment for the reader. And that's what I try to do. I mean, you can't go overboard, right? Because you can't write like a 10,000 page book. But at the same time, I try very hard in the nitty gritty to make it as close to real life as possible. If I was actually in this hotel room, what would I look for? What would stick out to me? And hopefully that resonates well with the readers when they're trying to enjoy a story.
Yeah, it makes sense. You don't, because there's always going to be somebody that has been in the place that you're talking about that's going to pick up on the one detail that you've gotten wrong. and be annoyed by it.
Yes, and let you know about it.
I've been that person. You read a book that takes place. I grew up in Montana. I read books that take place in Montana, and I'm like, you have never been to Montana in your life. I can tell.
Right.
And obviously you can't go everywhere all the time, but
That's right.
When it comes to the book, there's the story itself, the big picture story with the big pharma and the conspiracies and just everything that's going on. But then there's also David's backstory. There's all of these different levels. But what do you want for readers? Do you want them to just come away with this having read a really good action thriller story? Do you want them to take any big picture away from it? What are you hoping?
Man, you have good questions. So look, the truth is that with every book that I write, okay, I'm very aware that this is a form of entertainment. Okay. So I do want people to simply enjoy the book at a rudimentary level. Thriller novels are kind of meant to be escapes. They're meant to be beach reads. Like you want to be entertained. You want to try to figure out who did it. And, I try to plant enough clues that they should be able to figure things out and a couple of red herrings to throw them off the scent. And I do want the readers to enjoy the story and feel like it was worth their time and their money, because we all know that both of those buckets are limited. What I would say, beyond that, in addition to that high level for this book especially, is that, we all have to an extent be prepared to be the David of the story, where, he has to make some tough decisions for other people. Like he has to decide, am I going to do what's best for me, or am I going to do what's best for, in this case, millions of other people? Like this could work out really, really bad for me as an individual. But if I don't do this, there's a lot of suffering that could happen. And most of us are never going to be in that situation to that level. And most of us would never want to be in that situation. But there is an element, I wouldn't even say it's small, there is an element of me that would hope that people could read this and say to themselves, gosh, if this were me, what would I do? And maybe get them thinking a little bit more altruistically than they were before. Because that's what this character is, that's this evolution that I was talking about of the main character. Is he has to end up making some decisions that are at his own expense for others. And if that kind of transformative journey is possible for him as a fictional character, it could very well be possible for everyday people walking around. So not to get overly philosophical and into the meaning of life and all that sort of stuff, but in this particular book, beyond pure entertainment and enjoyment of the story, that is certainly something that I hope that readers would resonate with, and at least ask themselves, boy, this is a very relatable character. Goes to work every day, has a job, has a house, just like me. It feels a lot like me, the reader. What would I do if this happened to me? Like, and that would certainly be what I would hope they would take from this one.
I always put myself into the situations of readers, and my husband and I will have these conversations when we watch things like The Walking Dead. Okay, so it's post-apocalyptic. How long are you surviving? And I'm always like, about 10 minutes. I don't think I'm making it very far. It's always interesting to, my husband would last longer than I would. So one of us is getting there. But it's always interesting to put yourself in those situations. What would you do? And how would you go about it? But
and then be thankful that you're not in it.
Exactly. Yeah. Why do you write thrillers? Why this genre? What draws you to writing a thriller?
It's just the kind of book that I really enjoy reading, and that I really enjoy kind of putting plots around. I've written nonfiction trade publication articles for industry magazines. I've written narrative type stuff. There's just something cool about mystery, suspense, thriller genre where you can create these worlds and you can create these characters and you can have these exaggerated conspiracies and yet there's a dose of reality in them as well, right? And so I think that that's what I like the most about the genre, is that it affords this sort of like creative energy, and yet the best thrillers out there, the ones that I feel are written the best, are the most well received, they're also realistic. They have a dose of this. Yeah, this could actually happen. And that to me makes it very unique and very fun.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You have a book coming out in October. Are you in edits for that? Is that done? Are you working on something new?
Yeah, so I've got the book in October is basically edited. We're going through a couple of final tweak type things, and arcs are going to be available in about a month or two. But that book is pretty much done, and I've started tinkering with the next one and have a rough draft of that I'm sort of working on the side as well. And I've been very, very fortunate. The Deadly Deal has actually earned some awards recently that I may be going to some conferences and do some speaking for it. And so it's been kind of a fun balance between, the Deadly Deal, which is out and has been out for a couple of months, and I'm still kind of doing a little bit of marketing and speaking for it. And then the one that's, I haven't even revealed the title yet, right, to the readers, but that it's coming in October, and it's sort of right at that stage where we're finalizing covers and all that other good stuff, which is fun. And then to also be kind of tinkering with the early part of the process where you got draft one, and it makes for a lot of fun and a lot of fun ways to spend time with the writing.
Does it ever get hard? I talk with my hands. See, video makes me realize how much I talk with my hands.
I do too.
Put them on the desk. Do you ever, because you've got one that's out, one that's almost done, one that is just barely started. Do you ever kind of get confused which one you're talking about?
Sure. I get confused at the drop of a hat these days. Yeah. I mean, I try to keep it compartmentalized, so like this block of time, I'm going to stay focused on this project and what am I trying to accomplish for this project. And in a lot of ways, my life is probably too scheduled for some people, because between, a young family, a full-time job, various traveling that I have to do for work or whatever, and then those three projects at the same time, the only way that I know how to do it is to be pretty disciplined about where I spend my time and what I'm doing in that time. But I get them mixed up all the time. I mean, there have been times when, just the other day, it's so funny. It's so funny that you asked that, Sarah. It's like, are you secretly watching me as I work on this new book? I was typing something up. And this character's name is Barry. And I stopped typing and I said, Barry would not say this. Barry, and like, why did I? And then I stopped and I'm like, no, that's not Barry. That's Steve from the other book. What am I? So yes, it happens. It happens on a regular basis, I should say. But I try to mitigate it by having a pretty regimented, okay, I'm going to work on this book from this time to this time, and try not to think about anything else. But even with all that regiment, it happens all the time.
I can imagine. Yeah. It is time for our final break of this episode. I do have to say that keeping track of not only maybe multiple works in progress, but also the book that is already published that you're probably doing publicity for, keeping track of all those characters, all the plots, everything, especially if it's something that you wrote 6 months to a year ago, has got to be an interesting endeavor. I can only imagine. But when we come back with the final segment of this episode, we will be talking about Jay's path to publication? What made him finally decide, yep, you know what, I have something I want to write and I am going to try to write that for publication? So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As you know, I am speaking with author Jay Lee. Before the break, we were talking about keeping track of different books at various points in the process of being written, published, promoted, etc. And so let's go ahead now and return to that interview with the final segment of this episode. So writing sounds like it's something that you've always wanted to do. You've written in a few various capacities, but what was your path to publication? What made you decide, you know what, I'm finally going to do it. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write something for publication.
Yeah, it was really my now wife who encouraged me. She's a lot smarter than I am. She's a lot more competent than I am. She edits every single page. And she's just been a huge supporter of my writing endeavor. And she actually said, these are really good. You should just try. I mean, there's no pressure. It's not like, we're not going to go quit our day jobs or whatever, but like, you should give this a go. And then once the idea latched on for me, then it was kind of like, all right, now I'm gonna go do whatever I can. And if it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be, but I'm not gonna be the reason it doesn't happen. So I give credit to Kristen because she's an extremely awesome editor. She's a great writer. She's a voracious reader, and she's been my biggest supporter, bar none. So another one for me to say thanks to her.
Which is great. That's wonderful. And thank you to your wife for pushing you in that direction. From your own experience, then, what advice would you give to somebody who was in the place you were in and thinks they want to write?
Sure. So I would boil it down to number one, don't do it unless you really love it. Like, don't think. I've actually had some people reach out to me that have said, I think that, writing would kind of be a better job than what I have now, because you can make your own hours and, maybe just work a couple hours a day. And, and it's kind of like, oh, no. If you have to inspire yourself to do it, if you have to motivate yourself, like if writing is not just something that you love to do, don't try to do it for any kind of a career, because it's very hard and it's very demanding and it's very mentally consuming. And at least my experience, and maybe some authors have had some experiences where paths to publication have been much more direct, but it's not an easy putt. So you really need to have that passion and that love for it. And it can't be manufactured or fake. It's got to be like you really, really do love it, and you just do it because you love it. That said, the one piece of advice that I really do stick by is, you get better at doing something by doing it. And so even if you don't, I'm not saying set a page or a word count number that you have to hit every day or whatever, but if you really want to get better at something, whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter. Playing the piano, writing, whatever, you have to dedicate the time to it. And if most of us are very busy people, we've got a lot of things going on, but if it's important to you, you will make time for it. And that's really, it's pretty general advice, but I think it applies to any genre. I think it applies to any type of writer or whatever, whatever your specialty is. Those two pieces of advice feel universal and incontrovertible. Like, you have to love it, and you have to do it, and you'll get better just by doing it. You will make yourself a better writer.
Absolutely makes sense. Yeah. I would assume you like to read thrillers as well as write them. But when it comes to reading just for you, you're not researching something, you're not doing anything for the professional side of things, you're just reading for you. Go-to genres and authors.
Yeah, no, it really is my go-to pure enjoyment. There's two different categories. I generally have like 3 or 4 different books that I'm reading at any given time, and the suspense mystery genre really is up there. I mean, I like Kyle Mills, I like John Grisham, I like Mike Lawson. In the past year, I've read books by all of those guys. I think they're very entertaining, and I read them for the same reason that I described earlier. I kind of want to get lost in, the Joe DeMarco series that Mike writes, and try to figure out who the bad guy is and everything else. But I also read a lot of nonfiction. I was an engineering and sociology double major. And so I took a lot of classes on social psychology and sociological effects. And so I'm a big like Malcolm Gladwell type fan, Dan Ariely fan of books that describe human behavior in a way that can be sort of analyzed and spelled out. So I don't know if you've read any of his books, but those guys write a number of, there's a lot of books out there that are really cool and that just sort of take note of the human behavior patterns. And I really like to read those as well. So between those two genres and those 4 or 5 sets of authors, those are kind of the ones that I tend to gravitate towards. But in general, I'll give anything a try. I've tried a lot of different things, and there's a lot of great stuff out there to read. So we're very fortunate that we have all those options. Can I ask you the same question? What do you read for fun?
Oh, well, I read a lot for the podcast. So when people ask, are you a to be read list or a mood reader, I tend to read what's going next on the podcast. Okay. But then when I'm not, I am in a cozy mystery phase right now. I just like the kind of lighter nature of a cozy mystery. They're not usually as gruesome as some mysteries. I like that there's usually a dog or a cat. They're a little lighter, so I like cozy mysteries. I like romantic comedy if I'm in a lighter mood. I like memoirs a lot.
Okay.
So I've recently started appreciating thrillers more since interviewing people like yourselves. I didn't used to read thrillers. If they're thrillers like this one, more psychological, more suspense, that's great. If they veer into the more of the gruesome horror, no, that's not where I land. So, but I'll read pretty much anything. And I've learned, like thrillers, I've learned to really appreciate a lot more from talking to authors on the podcast, which has been a lot of fun.
Cool. Cool.
So I haven't counted recently, but you're somewhere between my 360, you're somewhere around 370, my 370th interview. So
wow.
I've learned of a lot of different authors that I'd never maybe would have heard of before, which has been great.
Wow, good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. Very cool.
Thank you.
Very cool.
What are you reading with your kids that you're particularly enjoying right now?
We read a lot of Bernstein Bears in our
Good.
house. So
Do you have the Mandela effect where you remember it being spelled differently?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. Oh yeah. And the other one that falls into is, have you ever read the Mercer Mayer series?
Yes, love Mercer Mayer.
Mercer Mayer was growing up. That was my favorite. It was my go-to for everything. And I'm pretty sure
critter.
we own every Mercer Mayer book. You know, that little critter. He's a cool little critter. But it's funny how when you read them as an adult, you realize things that you're like, oh yeah, it's
right.
It's so funny.
I'm thinking of this differently as a parent now than I did as a kid.
Yep. Yes. Those are definitely big winners in our home.
Love both of those. Excellent choices. Okay, so in terms of internet, if people want to learn more about you or the books, I know you have a website and then any social media that you're active on.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is www.jleethrillers.com. And from there, there are direct links. I do have an author page on Facebook. We're on X, formerly Twitter, Threads, Instagram, all the major social networking companies that are out there. But the website also offers excerpts of the book. It gives you a little bit more background about me. Let you know if you have a question, or if you read one of those details that I put in there that's not quite right, you want to tell me about it, you got a way to get in touch with me. So really what I would say is you can search the individual social media sites and Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that stuff. But the one-stop shop really is www.jleethrillers.com. You can get whatever it is that you'd be looking for from there. And I hope you do. And I hope you reach out, because I'd love to connect with anyone who's interested or has a question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We've talked about a few different things during our time together, but is there anything that we have not touched on that you were hoping to highlight during our time together?
No, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to invite me to your wonderful show and be a part of this. Writing's been a lot of fun. It's been very rewarding. Like I mentioned, The Deadly Deal was recently awarded the Medical Thriller of the Year, which was a real
congratulations
for me by Best Thrillers. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't really even know that it was a candidate at one point, but no, it's just having the opportunity to chat with you and connect with your audience and make myself available if they want to check. I just want to say thank you very much, Sarah, for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you as well for taking time out of your weekend to talk to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you once again to Jay for joining me to talk about The Deadly Deal and writing. As I said, I really appreciate it. I really do appreciate every author that joins me on this podcast. It is wonderful to have them. I love meeting new authors. I love meeting or reading new books that I maybe wouldn't have encountered had it not been for the podcast. So if you are a fan of thrillers, especially suspense and a little bit of psychological thriller, then you definitely want to check out The Deadly Deal. Like I said, I really loved the character of Anne. I thought she was a great addition to the story, definitely a good help to David, the main character. And you heard Jay talk about David as the main character and how he's one of the favorite protagonists that Jay has ever written. So if that isn't a good recommendation, I don't know what is. But as I said, if you are a fan of the thriller, you should definitely check out this and some of the other two books that Jay has written. Or maybe you have a thriller lover in your life and you're looking to get them a new book. This might be something that you want to check out. I hope that you will join me for the next episode as well. Next time I will be speaking to author Betty Joyce Nash about her coming of age novel, Everybody Here Is Kin. I had a really lovely conversation with Betty Joyce over the weekend on Sunday. We actually talked on St. Patrick's Day. That episode will be out on Friday. Thank you for hanging in there with me on my very first video episode. As I said, there are growing edges. I always tell students and other people that I work with that usually if you are trying something new and you don't go back later and look at that first attempt and cringe a little bit, you haven't grown very much. So I can definitely feel or foresee some cringeworthy moments when I look back at this episode. But thank you so much to Jay for being the very first video podcast guest for the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast presented by the GSMC Entertainment Network. Your support, as I say all the time, means so much to us here at the podcast, but also at the podcast network. Please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on social media. You can find the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. I love hearing from listeners, so come find the podcast and by extension me on social media and leave a comment. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me what is on your TBR. All those nosy questions that I love asking and getting answers for. Thank you once again and have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope no matter what you're doing, where you are, what your week might bring, that no matter what, you can find yourself, you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.